total taxable income for each employee. And for that, I need to multiply each employee's wage by how many hours they worked. So I could do that in my head, or I could use the calculator and then just put in the information here. But that is exactly one of the things that Excel does best. Excel is a spreadsheet tool, yes, but it's also a calculator. It has built in pretty much all of the calculator functions and operators that you would need. So here on cell E2, I'm going to create my first formula. In Excel, whenever you're creating a formula, you need to start by typing equals. When I first started using Excel, this was confusing to me until I thought about algebra. In my Algebra 1 class that I took, I remember learning about variables. And there would be formulas like x equals, and then it would be y plus 10 divided by 3 or whatever. That's basically what we're doing here. So whenever I type equals, before I type it, I think E2, and then I type equals. So cell E2 equals whatever comes next. And here I could just type in 13.9, and then I could put in multiplied by, or times. And in Excel, we use an asterisk for multiply. So 13.9 multiplied by 158. And then I can type enter on the keyboard, and that is the taxable income for Julia. So that's one way to do a formula in Excel. You can type in the numbers, you can use plus signs, minus signs, asterisks for multiply, forward slash for divide, and then just tap enter, and that formula will be executed. But there's another way to do the same thing, and it's a better way. Again, I need to start by clicking on the cell and then typing equals. But this time, instead of typing in the numbers, I'm going to type in the cell references. If you remember, in Excel, we can describe every cell in this spreadsheet. We can name it, basically. And remember, we do have this name box in the upper left corner to help us with that. So equals, and I'm going to name or describe this cell. So that would be C2. So I'll just type in C2 asterisk for multiplied by D2. And I'll type in D2. Now you'll notice as I typed in those cell references, Excel highlighted them in different colors. So I can see exactly what I'm about to do. Now I'll tap enter on the keyboard and I get the same result, but this time it's a little better. The reason why it's better is because this formula now is dynamic. If I change the contents of one of these cells, let's say it's a mistake, Julia doesn't really have a wage of 13.9, it's more like 14.25. I can tap enter and look at the taxable income, it's going to change. So this is a superior way to create a formula in Excel. There is one other method that I want you to be aware of. I could type equals, and then instead of typing the cell references, C3 asterisk D3, I could just click on the cell. So C3 asterisk, and then click on D3. Tap enter, and my formula produces results. Now it looks like the contents of cell E2 and cell E3 are simple numbers. It looks like the contents of E2 is 2,251.5 and the contents of E3, 2,480. But that's not actually true. If I double click on E2, you can see that the contents of that cell is just a formula. What about E3? Double click, the contents of that cell is a formula. So we see the results of the formula, but what actually is in the cell is a formula. And let's talk about the type of formula that we have. In both cases, these are relative cell references. What that means is, when I say C3 multiplied by D3, what Excel is interpreting that as being is just to multiply whatever is in two cells to the left, multiply that by whatever is in one cell to the left. So watch what happens now when I use the autofill handle. If you remember, the autofill handle lets me extend a pattern. If there is no pattern, what it does is it copies the contents of a cell. So I'm going to use the autofill handle, and I could click and drag all the way down the spreadsheet like I have in the past, but I want you to see a shortcut. If you have a table basically of data that's all together, instead of clicking and dragging on the autofill handle, it is faster just to double click on the autofill handle and it automatically extends down the page. So look at that. Because I use the autofill handle, I don't have to keep creating formula after formula after formula. My formula was copied and extended down the spreadsheet because I used the autofill handle. Now, how come that worked? The reason it worked is because of what I said a minute ago. Excel is interpreting these cell references as being relative, not absolute. So C3, Excel just interprets that as two cells to the left, D3, one cell to the left. Multiply the two together, you get a result. So down here, when I copied that formula down using the autofill handle, it just adjusted those cell references. It's still two cells to the left multiplied by one cell to the left. It's no longer bothering with C3 and D3. It's moved on to C4 times D4. What about down here? Double click, C7 multiplied by D7. The reason this works is because these are relative cell references. Now, what if I wanted to calculate the amount of taxes to be paid? Now, I understand this isn't how it's normally done, but let's pretend. And let's say the tax rate is 7%. And I'm going to enter this as a decimal, 0.07, and I tap enter. Let's use a formula now to calculate the taxes to be paid. I'll click here on cell F2, and in my head, I'll say to myself, cell F2, and then I type equals the taxable income of Julia in this case, multiplied by the tax rate, H1. I'll tap enter on the keyboard, and you can see the results. This worked beautifully. But what happens when I use the autofill handle and double click to extend that down the page? It didn't work. Why didn't it work? Let's look at these formulas. Because I used relative cell references here in my original formula, Excel is looking one cell to the left and multiplying it by two cells to the right and one above. So when I copied that formula down the spreadsheet, it continued that pattern. It's looking one cell to the left, two cells to the right, and one up. And because these cells are empty, it's like multiplying by 0. So I'm going to fix this formula by clicking on cell F2. And in Excel, anytime I want to extend a formula, work on a formula, what I like to do is click on a cell, and then instead of editing it here by double clicking on it and making some changes, it's easier and better in most cases to just select the cell and then go up here to what's called the formula bar. This is a safer, easier, better place to edit and work with your Excel formulas. So right now, these are relative cell references. I want to change the H1 reference to become an absolute cell reference. The way I do that is by putting a $sign in front of the H and a $sign in front of the 1, and then tap enter on the keyboard. And what those $signs do is they force Excel, whenever this formula is copied or used, to always refer exactly to column H and to row 1. So that part of the formula, no matter how far down the spreadsheet I copy it, it will remain fixed on cell H1. Let's try it now. I'll double click on the autofill handle. It copies down the page. Let's see if it's working. It looks like it is. If I double click on any of these formulas, you can see they're all referring back to cell H1, and that's where the tax rate is kept. So that's a very important concept to understand, the difference between relative cell references like this one and absolute cell references like this one. And cell references could be partially relative and partially absolute. I could have left the $sign off the H and just kept the $sign on the 1. There are two more things you need to know about using formulas before we move on. The first is that from time to time, you may make a mistake in your formulas. For example, if I tried dividing the contents of cell E2 by 0, that's not possible. It's an error. I tap enter on the keyboard and I'll get an error message. Error messages look something like this, often with hashtags or other symbols. Sometimes you'll be warned that what you're entering may be an error. For example, if I do it this way, I get a warning. Do I want to accept their correction? Yes or no? And so if you see things like this, that's okay. This is Excel trying to warn me that I've created something that is producing an error. And in most cases, I'll go to the formula bar to fix that error. And finally, it's important to know that you can change the name of a cell and also the name of a range. So for example, I could click here on F2 and drag all the way down the spreadsheet. And then I could go here to the name box and I could click and I could change the name that's in that box to be something like taxes owed. And I'm not going to put in any spaces there. I'll tap enter on the keyboard. And now that range has its own special name. If I forget what I named that range, I can always click here on this drop down arrow and it tells me taxes owed. Now, why would that be important? You'll learn that later, but let me give you a quick preview. In my formula, instead of referring just to a cell like E3, I could refer to a named cell or a named range. So I could type in taxes owed and then continue my